Oulu, Wisconsin, September 1893. The air held the first clean, sharp promise of the cold to come, a warning carried on the wind that swept south across the vast, unforgiving water of Lake Superior. Most men were racing the season, their axes and saws ringing through the woods as they corded up the last of the winter's fuel. But Eelis Lahtinen was mixing mud. In a shallow wooden trough, he worked a slurry of gray clay dug from the creek bed and the fine, pale ash from his cook stove. He added water slowly, his hands plunging into the mixture, kneading it to a thick, consistent paste. His home was not a log cabin, but a surplus military oddity, a long arch of corrugated iron riveted together, a shape like a loaf of bread that baked in the summer and froze in the winter. Now, he was slathering this strange gray plaster onto it, inside and out. Gerrit Knudsvig, the foreman of the local threshing crew, stopped his wagon on the track that ran past Lahtinen's 30 acres. He was a big Norwegian, a man whose competence was written in the thick set of his shoulders and the confident lines around his eyes. He watched for a long moment, a slow grin spreading across his face. "What in God's name is that, Lahtinen?" he called out. Two of his men, Olafsson and Berg, chuckled in the wagon bed. Eelis looked up, his hands and forearms caked in the gray paste. He wiped a smear of sweat from his brow with the back of a clean wrist. "Sealing it," he said, his English still carrying the flat, measured cadence of his native Finland. Knudsvig laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried across the clearing. "Sealing it with mud? That's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. You're making a home for swallows, not a house for winter." He shook his head, looking at his men with theatrical disbelief. The man's gone mad, plastering his tin shed like a bird's nest. The consensus was swift and brutal. The Finn was a fool. What did this Finnish sauna builder understand about infiltration? About the physics of a house that breathes? That the most experienced men in Wisconsin had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the profound difference between insulation and air sealing. A lesson written in frost and fire on the brutal frontier. It's a principle that modern building science is only now fully embracing, but one this quiet immigrant knew in his bones. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories of forgotten ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. It ensures you won't miss the next chapter of practical wisdom from our past. Now, what was the first thing you ever built with your own hands? Let me know in the comments below. Eelis Lahtinen was not a farmer. He was not a logger, nor a carpenter, nor any of the things a man was supposed to be in northern Wisconsin. In the old country, he had been a builder of saunas, the traditional smoke saunas of Finland. His hands were not accustomed to the heft of an axe, but to the delicate feel of a trowel, the specific gravity of a clay slurry, the precise stacking of river stones to form the quonset, the heart of the sauna. He was a master of sealing structures to hold the intense, wet, sacred heat of the loili, the blast of steam from water thrown on hot stones. His entire trade was a battle against the escape of heat and vapor, a science of seamlessness. He, his wife Anya, and their two small children, Maddie and Sophia, had arrived the previous autumn, drawn by the promise of land and the familiar echo of pine forests. The corrugated iron hut was all they could afford, a kit purchased from a catalog for $17. It went up fast. It was also a thermal catastrophe. Their first winter had been a lesson in pure misery. The card from the user story details the specific nature of their suffering, and it was relentless. The warmth from their cast iron stove was a lie. It stopped at arm's length. Beyond that small circle of radiant heat, the air was a hostile, penetrating cold. Anja would try to read to the children in the evenings, their bodies huddled together under a thick wool blanket, but their breath would plume in the frigid air just feet from the glowing stove. At night, the very posts of their simple wooden bed frames would grow a crystalline fur of hoarfrost. Every morning, Eelis would have to break a skin of ice in the water bucket kept inside the house. Their cat, a creature of instinct and thermal efficiency, became a living barometer of their failure. It would not leave the stove. It slept pressed against the warm iron, ate there, and watched the family's suffering with indifferent, knowledgeable eyes. The animal understood the physics better than they did. Only direct contact with the source of heat offered any real comfort. The air itself was a thief. Eelis burned through their woodpile at an astonishing rate. He fed the stove constantly, a desperate, losing battle. The iron walls, thin and uninsulated, conducted heat away almost as fast as the fire could produce it. But Eelis knew it was more than that. He could feel it. On windy nights, he could feel the house breathe. A cold draft would snake across the floor. A candle flame would flicker for no apparent reason. The structure was leaking. Not water, but air. Precious, heated air was hemorrhaging out of 1,000 invisible wounds, and the killing cold of a Wisconsin winter was pouring in to replace it. He had built a sieve, not a home. Staring at the hoarfrost on his children's blankets one morning, a memory surfaced. The feel of ash and clay mortar sealing the gaps between the rough-hewn logs of a sauna, creating a vessel so tight it could hold smoke for hours, then heat for a full day. The problem wasn't the iron. The problem was the seams. The conventional failure of these early metal buildings was spectacular. They were a triumph of industrial production and a complete disaster of thermal design. In a place like northern Wisconsin, that failure was measured in cords of wood, in frostbite, and sometimes in lives. The issue wasn't just that the thin iron was a poor insulator, everyone knew that. The real, insidious problem was infiltration. A Quonset hut was assembled from dozens of curved, corrugated sheets of galvanized iron. Each sheet overlapped the next by a few inches and was held in place by a line of rivets. Every single rivet was a potential leak. Every single overlapping seam, no matter how tightly bolted, was a microscopic channel for air. Standing inside on a bright day, you might not see any light coming through, but the air, a fluid far more persistent than light, found its way. A building science principle states that a collection of small leaks is far worse than one large one. A 1-foot square hole in a wall is obvious and gets patched, but the equivalent of that hole, spread out over 500 feet, of tiny 1/32 inch gaps along every seam and rivet, is invisible and deadly. The total leakage area on Eelis Lahtinen's small hut was likely more than 2 square feet. It was like living with 2 windows wide open all winter long. And then there was the wind. The unrelenting wind off Lake Superior acted like a giant pump. When it slammed into the curved windward side of the hut, it created positive pressure, forcing cold, dense air inward through every crack. Simultaneously, it created negative pressure on the leeward side, sucking the warm, buoyant interior air outward. This phenomenon, known as the stack effect, was magnified by the building's shape and the constant wind. It created a relentless convective loop. The stove would heat the air, the warm air would rise and be pulled out through the upper seams, and cold air would be forced in through the lower ones to replace it. Eelis was trying to heat all of northern Wisconsin, 1 cubic foot at a time. His neighbors, in their log and frame houses, fared better, but not by much. Their structures were also leaky. Garrett Knutsvig's threshing crew lived in a long wooden bunkhouse where the men stuffed rags and newspaper into the gaps between the boards. They kept a massive barrel stove roaring 24 hours a day, burning through a full cord of wood every 5 days. Yet the corners of the room never rose above freezing. They accepted this as the price of winter. You fought it with bigger fires and more layers of wool. The idea of making a building truly airtight was as foreign as the language Eelis Lahtinen spoke. A house had to breathe, they said, confusing a damp, drafty structure with a healthy one. They saw the problem as a lack of heat. Eelis was beginning to understand it was an excess of air. Eelis began his work in the last warm days of September. The process was methodical, born of ancient knowledge. First, the materials. He dug the clay from a deposit 50 yards from his hut where the small creek turned. He chose it carefully, feeling for its plasticity, its stickiness. He hauled it back in a wheelbarrow, load after load, and spread it on a tarp to dry just enough to be broken up. The second ingredient was ash. All winter, he had cleaned the fine, white-gray powder from his stove, but instead of discarding it, he'd saved it in barrels behind the hut. Wood ash, rich in potassium and calcium carbonates, acted as a mild pozzolan, a substance that reacts with calcium hydroxide in the presence of water to form compounds with cementitious properties. It wasn't as strong as modern cement, but it would create a durable, slightly flexible, and remarkably effective sealant. He mixed the two in a large trough, adding water until he had a thick, workable paste, the consistency of wet dough. To this, he added a small amount of chopped straw as a binder to reduce cracking as it dried. The recipe was not written down. It was in his hands, in the feel of the mixture. He started on the inside. With a simple wooden trowel, he forced the gray plaster into every joint, every seam, every single rivet head. This was not a surface coat, it was an injection. He worked the material into the deep corrugations where the sheets overlapped, filling the channels completely. He paid special attention to the bottom edge where the iron met the wooden foundation, a notorious source of air leakage. He built up a thick, continuous fillet of the clay mixture, wetting the wall to the floor. The work was slow, painstaking. Maddie and Sophia watched him, their small faces smudged with gray as they tried to help with their own small handfuls of mud. Anya brought him water, her expression a mixture of trust and concern. "It looks strange, Eelis," she said one afternoon, her head tilted. "Like a mud turtle." He just nodded, his focus absolute. He was not plastering a wall. He was closing 1,000 tiny mouths. After 2 weeks, the interior was done. He had applied a layer 3 inches thick, smoothing it into a single, seamless, monolithic surface. He left it to cure, keeping the doors open during the day to allow the moisture to escape. Then he moved to the outside, repeating the entire process. He worked against the clock, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. It was during this phase that Gerrit Knudsvig made his most pointed critique. He'd seen the interior work and remained skeptical, but the exterior application confirmed his diagnosis of foolishness. He stopped his wagon again, this time getting down to inspect Eelis's handiwork up close. He poked a thick finger at the still damp plaster. "I've been thinking on this, Lahtinen," Knudsvig said, his tone that of a man delivering a patient but firm verdict. He was not being malicious. He was offering the genuine, considered opinion of an experienced man. Iron and mud don't live together. That iron is going to sweat on the inside. It's going to move. It heats up in the sun, cools down at night. It expands and it shrinks. That damned mud will crack right off the iron the minute you get a warm day in February. Come April, it'll be peeling off in sheets. You'll be patching that fool thing all summer long." He stood back, arms crossed, confident in his analysis. It was sound, practical logic, based on everything he knew about conventional materials. Eelis paused his work, looking from Knudsvig's face to the wall and back. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his methods. He simply gave a small shrug. "Maybe," he said. Then he scooped another trowel full of gray paste and went back to work. The conversation was over. The test would be the winter. To understand the genius of what Eelis Lahtinen was doing, you have to understand the three ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. His neighbors were only fighting one of them. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. A hot iron skillet handle burns your hand through conduction. The thin iron walls of the Quonset were excellent conductors, meaning they transferred the heat from inside the hut to the outside air with brutal efficiency. A thick log wall was a much poorer conductor, which is why cabins were warmer. This is the part everyone understood. Their solution was to add insulation: more logs, more sod, more anything to slow the conductive loss. Radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. The sun warms the earth through radiation. A fire warms your face from across the room the same way. A dark, rough surface radiates heat more effectively than a bright, shiny one. The unpainted iron of the hut was a moderate radiator of heat, but the great, unacknowledged killer was convection, which is the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids, in this case, air. This is the principle of infiltration. When cold air leaks into a house, it physically displaces the warm air, which leaks out. You are not just losing heat, you are losing the very air you paid to heat. No amount of insulation can stop this if the air can simply bypass it. Imagine wearing the world's thickest, warmest wool coat, but leaving it completely unbuttoned in a gale. The coat's insulating value becomes meaningless because the wind is blowing right through it, stripping heat from your body by convection. Eelis Lahtinen's neighbors were all wearing unbuttoned coats. They kept adding more wool, thicker walls, more wood in the stove, but they never addressed the wind blowing right through the gaps. Their focus on conduction was misplaced. In a building as leaky as a Quonset hut, driven by the high winds of the Great Lakes, infiltration could account for over 50% of the total heat loss. It was a massive, invisible hole in their energy budget. The ash and clay plaster Eelis was applying had some modest insulating value, certainly better than bare iron. But its primary function was not to slow conduction. Its primary function was to stop convection. It was the button for the coat. By meticulously filling every single seam, crack, and corrugation, he was transforming a structure made of dozens of separate leaky components into a single, monolithic, airtight shell. The 3-inch layer of plaster bonded inside and out, effectively entombed the iron sheets, creating a continuous barrier. The wind could beat against the outside of the hut, but it could no longer force its way through. The science of his mixture was subtle. The clay provided the mass and the seal. The ash provided a chemical binding action and a degree of insulation. The straw provided tensile strength, preventing large cracks from forming as the plaster cured and underwent thermal stress. Knudsvig was right that the iron would expand and contract. But he underestimated the plaster. It wasn't brittle like a cement render. It had just enough plasticity to accommodate the minor movements of the metal substrate without catastrophic failure. Eelis wasn't just plastering a wall. He was engineering a composite system. He was building a lung that could hold its breath. The first snows came in late October. By mid-November, the ground was frozen solid and winter had settled in. But the real test began on the 3rd of January, 1894. A low-pressure system stalled over Lake Superior, which was still largely unfrozen, and began to pull vast quantities of moisture and Arctic air into a furious vortex. It was the beginning of a classic lake effect blizzard. For 9 consecutive days, the wind blew out of the northwest at a sustained 40 miles per hour, gusting to 60. It drove a blinding torrent of fine, hard snow horizontally across the landscape. The temperature plummeted to 18 degrees below zero and stayed there. In Oulu, 38 inches of snow fell, but it didn't fall so much as arrive, blasted into immense, sculpted drifts against every obstacle. For the settlers, it was a state of siege. The world shrank to the interior of their homes. In the bunkhouse of Gerrit Knudsvig's crew, the fight for warmth was a desperate, full-time occupation. The wind was a physical presence, a malevolent intelligence seeking every crack. It screamed through the gaps in the window sashes. It made the walls groan and pop. Fine powder snow, driven with the force of sand, sifted in around the doorframe, forming a perfect, crystalline drift on the floor inside. They had two men whose only job was to feed the barrel stove. It glowed a dull red, consuming seasoned oak at a terrifying rate, yet the warmth barely reached the bunks along the walls. The men lived in their coats and hats, their faces raw from the dry, superheated air near the stove, and their backs chilled by the drafts. At the Lahtinen Quonset, the scene was entirely different. Outside, the storm was a screaming fury. The curved roof was designed to shed wind, and the new plaster skin gave it a solid, seamless surface. Snow collected in a deep, insulating drift on the leeward side but was scoured clean on the windward face. The wind found no purchase, no whistle, no crack to exploit. Inside there was silence. The roar of the blizzard was a muted, distant thing, the sound of a faraway ocean. The air was still. The flame of their single kerosene lantern on the table did not flicker. It burned with a steady, unwavering yellow light. Eelis kept a small, quiet fire in the stove, adding a single split log every 2 or 3 hours. The stove was not a weapon in a desperate battle. It was simply a hearth. The heat it produced stayed in the house. Anya sat in her rocking chair, 10 feet from the stove, mending a sock, her fingers nimble and warm. The children, Maddie and Sophia, were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a rag rug in the middle of the wooden floor with a set of carved wooden animals, their jackets and hats hung on pegs by the door. The cat was not on the stove. It was curled asleep on the foot of Sophia's bed. These were small acts of domestic peace, of normalcy, that in the context of the blizzard raging outside were profound statements of thermal triumph. The house was working, the seal was holding, and on the south-facing wall, the small pane of glass that served as their only window remained completely clear. There was not a single feather of frost on it. On the 6th day of the blizzard, Gerrit Knudsvig realized he was running low on kerosene for his lanterns. The general store was a half-mile away, a journey that was daunting but not impossible during a lull. He waited until the wind dropped from a roar to a steady, brutal blow, bundled himself in his heaviest coat, and set out. He walked bent into the wind, following the barely visible track of the road. He was halfway there when a sudden, violent squall descended, a true whiteout. The world vanished into a churning vortex of white. The wind rose to a physical blow, staggering him. He couldn't see 5 feet. Disoriented, he knew the only landmark nearby was the Lahtinen place. He stumbled toward it, his face stinging with wind-driven ice crystals. He finally saw the low, dark curve of the Quonset hut, half buried in a drift, and instinctively ducked into its lee to escape the punishing force of the wind. And in that pocket of relative calm, the vindication occurred. It was a moment of pure sensory revelation. His own heavy canvas coat, battered by the gust, was humming and flapping violently. The wind screamed past the corner of the hut. He could hear the high, piercing whistle of the wind finding the nail heads on his own distant bunkhouse. But the plastered wall of the Quonset, inches from his face, was utterly, profoundly silent. He braced his gloved hand against it, expecting to feel the familiar, deep vibration of sheet iron straining against the wind, the hum of 1,000 tiny leaks. He felt nothing. It was inert, solid. It felt like stone. The wind was hitting it, parting around it and moving on. It was being given no entry, no voice. His breathing ragged, he shuffled along the wall, until he was in front of the small, south-facing window. He peered through the storm at the glass. He knew what he should see. Every pane of glass in the county, including his own, was opaque, covered in a thick, intricate jungle of ice ferns, a crystalline record of heat loss and interior moisture. But this window was bare. It was just glass. Through it, he could see the impossible, the faint, steady glow of a lantern inside, and the clear, calm space of a warm room. The gap between what he knew to be true and what he was seeing was absolute. A shack of iron, plastered in mud and ash, was performing better than any log or frame building in the township. It was defying the storm. It was defying logic. It was defying winter itself. The sheer, undeniable evidence of that clear pane of glass broke something in him. The rigid certainty of his own experience. He didn't knock on the door. He felt no need to confirm what his senses had already told him. He stood there for a full minute, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the silent wall, then turned and fought his way back to his own cold, noisy, leaking bunkhouse. When the blizzard finally broke 3 days later, Knudsvig walked over to the Lahtinen place. Eelis was outside, shoveling a path. The Norwegian approached, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a quiet, searching respect. "Lahtinen," he said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin toward the hut. "Your window." During the storm. It was clear. Eelis stopped shoveling and leaned on the handle. He simply nodded. "The fire is small," he offered, as if that explained everything. "How?" Knudsvig asked. It was not a challenge, but a genuine plea for understanding. "That plaster, I said it would crack. I said it would peel." "It holds," Eelis said. He walked to the wall and laid a bare hand on it. "It is not two things, iron and mud. It is one thing now, together." He tried to explain in his limited English, describing not the science, but the effect. He spoke of the wind having no voice, of the air inside being quiet. Knudsvig listened, not to the words, but to the quiet confidence behind them. He finally understood he was not talking to a fool, but to a master of a different kind of knowledge. "You didn't build a wall," he thought, looking at the seamless gray structure. "You taught the iron to hold its tongue." Gerrit Knudsvig became Eelis Lahtinen's most powerful advocate. The story of the silent wall and the clear window spread through the community, carried by the sheer force of Knudsvig's conviction. He was a man whose judgment people trusted, and his conversion was more compelling than any argument. He brought his crew over to see it. Men who had spent 9 days freezing in a drafty bunkhouse walked into the Lahtinen's Quonset and were stunned by the quiet, even warmth. They touched the interior walls, which felt cool but not frigid, and held their hands up to the seams, feeling for drafts that weren't there. That spring, 3 other families with similar metal outbuildings or sheds mixed up their own batches of ash and clay. Eelis gave the recipe freely to anyone who asked, demonstrating the right consistency, the way to work the material deep into the joints. The results were immediate and undeniable. The innovation spread through the informal networks of the immigrant community. A cousin visiting from Hancock, Michigan, the heart of the Finnish-American copper country, heard the story and saw the proof. He took the knowledge back with him. Hancock was home to the Suomalainen Luterilainen Kustannusliike, the Finnish Lutheran book concern, which published newspapers, books, and almanacs for the diaspora. An editor there, recognizing the profound practical value of the idea, included a short article in the 1895 edition of their popular annual almanac. The article, titled Lämminreikinen Savesta, Jatukasta, a warm building of clay and ash, gave the recipe and instructions. These almanacs were essential items in Finnish households across the upper Midwest, a connection to home and a repository of useful knowledge. By the spring of 1895, copies had shipped by rail and post to communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Eelis Lahtinen's quiet innovation was no longer a local curiosity. It was a piece of codified knowledge, spreading far beyond the man who had first mixed mud in a trough in Oulu. What Eelis Lahtinen did anticipated the core principles of modern building science by nearly a century. Today, we spend enormous effort and money creating what he achieved with creek mud and stove ash. A continuous, monolithic air barrier. We wrap our houses in advanced polymer membranes like Tyvek. We use spray foam insulations that expand to seal every crack. We perform blower door tests, depressurizing a house with a powerful fan to measure its air tightness in units of air changes per hour. The Passive House Standard, the most rigorous energy efficiency standard in the world, is built almost entirely around the principle of making a structure phenomenally airtight first, and then insulating it. Eelis Lahtinen had no concept of BTUs or pascals of pressure, but he had a deep, intuitive understanding of the fundamental truth. A building's first defense against the cold is not to be thick, but to be sealed. The story of the plastered Quonset hut is a quiet lesson in the nature of problems. Eelis Lahtinen's neighbors saw their struggle with winter as a battle of brute force. Their enemy was the cold, and their weapon was fire. They believed the solution was to produce more heat and build thicker walls to slow its escape. They were fighting a war of attrition, and they were barely holding their own. Eelis, shaped by a different tradition, saw a different problem. He knew that the savvy sauna's power came not from its fire, but from its integrity as a vessel. The problem wasn't the cold outside, it was the unsealed nature of the shelter inside. He didn't add a better shield to fight the winter. He simply closed the 1,000 small mouths the iron was breathing through. His neighbors were shouting at the storm with a roaring fire. Eelis taught his house to be silent, and in that silence his family found a warmth that no amount of firewood alone could provide. The frontier didn't reward theory. It rewarded what worked. And in the brutal winter of 1894, silence worked better than noise. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of frontier ingenuity. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of practical wisdom. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What modern problems could be solved by looking at them from a completely different, perhaps older, perspective? Share your ideas in the comments section below. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. We present historically inspired reconstructions based on real practices from the period. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes, while the techniques and scientific principles discussed are grounded in historical fact. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This presentation does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.